All right, welcome to the second part of this talk on immigration, urbanization, social reform, and political machines in the Gilded Age. If you have not viewed the first part, I don't know if that's necessary to understand the second part, but it definitely provides some context. Um, we already talked about the first 2 points, immigration, and some of the reactions to immigration in terms of the reform movements. And today we're going to talk about the process of urbanization and responses to urbanization. And then ultimately, we're going to dive further into one of the more interesting responses to immigration and urbanization, and that is through political machines. So I'm going to fly past here our immigration discussion to get us to urbanization. And I'm going to X myself out of this. You don't need to see me. What's the point in seeing me when you can see this street scene of New York around 1900? It's an exciting scene. New York became, in many ways, the apple of the world's eye. The Big Apple became the second most populous city after London. It was a fascinating patchwork quilt, a vast patchwork quilt of different ethnicities and religions. And for those of you who, like me, prefer to be sort of cosmopolitan in nature, this is an awesome photo to you. You think this is exciting. You think this is pretty cool. You want to be, if you're like me, up in this mix. But to a lot of Americans, this is an image of a dystopia. It's dirty. It's rampant with mystery. Some people see this street scene and they see crime and corruption and moral debasement. Others see multiculturalism and they see, sort of effervescent cultural life. Yeah. Um, and so when we talk about urbanization, we have to, talk about um, the excitement of it, the thrill of it, the dream of it, but we also have to recognize that not everybody was on board with that dream. And that's including but not limited to people in the South and rural regions. All right. So I'm going to throw you into some of the numbers. Yeah, I'm not going to take as deep of a dive into the numbers as I did yesterday with the immigration lecture, but let's look at a few numbers just to give some context and meaning to this revolutionary process of urbanization. Between 1870 and 1920, so over the course of two generations, the urban population in America went from 10 to 54 million. So that is astounding. It's a 5.5-fold increase in the number of people living in cities. This fundamentally changes what America is, right? And if you want to understand American history and you want to understand changes in it, really meditate on that number. By 1910, immigrant families were more than half of the population of America's biggest cities. So it's not that just the number of people living in cities grew, and it's not just that the number of cities grew, it's that the people who inhabited these cities were largely immigrants. And so, as we know, of course, that, raised the concerns, to put it sort of neutrally, although I'm not sure that I should, of a lot of Americans who feared and loathed immigrants, per our previous lecture. So in this way, cities became like just like it is today when we talk about urban life in America, when certain people talk about urban life, that is sort of a dog whistle. It's a derogation of, you know, multiculturalism and of immigration. Yeah. By 1890, there were two times more Irish people living in New York than in Dublin, which I think is awesome, but which a lot of people at the time found offensive, right? Like these Irish Catholics, they're taken over. They own New York, like they own the Big Apple. And again, we talked about some of this vis-a-vis immigration in the previous part of this lecture. And in addition to immigrants from around the world, and particularly immigrants from Ireland, you had between 1890 and 1910 a couple 100,000 African Americans moving north to cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago, Philly. And then in a lecture that I'm going to give another time, we have the so called Great Migration, where many millions more African Americans moved north from the American South. All right. So these numbers are pretty astounding. I think, they're just numbers, but you should let yourself be astounded by them. These numbers are likewise astounding. Between 1860 and 1900, if you're feasting your eyes on these, please forgive me. I'm going to be slurping coffee rather like desperately this morning. There's just not enough I can get. Pandemic sleep schedule being what it is. But between 1860 and 1900, the population of New York City doubled. The population of Philly doubled and then some. Boston tripled. Baltimore doubled and then some. Cincinnati doubled. St. Louis tripled. And my fair town, Chicagoland, USA, the city of big shoulders, blew up between 1860 to 1900, making it the greatest city in the history of the world. I might be biased on that one. And these cities were not evenly distributed throughout the United States. You're looking at this map of the United States, I assume, and you see that the bigger red dots are the bigger cities. And while you do have Minneapolis as an outlier, New Orleans as an outlier, San Francisco, the overwhelming number of cities, and surely the biggest cities, are in the North and the Northeast in particular, right? And so this is a revolutionary change: industrialization, immigration, urbanization, revolutionary changes in the United States. But the South really isn't partaking in that revolution in the same way, are they? Yeah. This is a graph showing the urban makeup of the US population from 1790 to 2010. And what you see is that in 1790, basically no one lived in cities. What is that, like 4% of people live in cities. And then in 2010, something like 80% of Americans live in cities. And, I am a subscriber to the notion that the future belongs to cities. Yeah. For various reasons, which perhaps another time we'll talk about. But surely the story of American history, which is what we're here to learn, is the story of urbanization, the story of development, the story of immigration, industrialization, now post-industrialization, and immigration. Thus the lecture. All right. Now, here is a table from an old book, but it's an interesting way to look at it. So the population of the United States in 1900 is 76 million. Of that 76 million, 41 million are native, right? So native white people born in the United States to native parents, which is to say, and native is sort of a vexed word in this context, of course, but born in the United States. So you were born in the United States, both your parents were born in the United States. Then you have 15 million, 16 million people ish who were born in America, but their parents weren't. And you have 10 million people in 1900 who weren't born in the United States. And then, pardon the language here, 9 million African Americans, right? So, but then you contrast that to the cities of 100,000 people or more. And whereas 54% of people living in America were native, it's only 10% in the cities. Yeah. 21% were native foreign, and that's 33%. So we have this disparity between the ethno religious makeup and the immigration status, if you will, of people in cities relative to people outside of cities. So in this way, we see the seeds of the two Americas that we see today, right? This is uh, a century old process, but the legacy of it is omnipresent in discussions of contemporary American politics and culture. What brought Americans to the cities? Again, just like when we were talking about immigration, we talk about pull factors and push factors. Well, what brought people to cities? Well, we talked about populism, right? And there were massive farm foreclosures, and that goes some way to explaining, a lot of people who came to the cities. They were working on the farm. They had a farm, but they fell into debt. They couldn't handle those pressures of being farmers in the competitive, cutthroat world of you know pre-progressive uh, era farm life. And so they had to leave the farms, whether they were forced off or they chose to get off the farms. They moved to the city. They moved back to the city, a reverse migration from farm to factory. Yeah. There were people who lost their farms, and then there were people who were like, I just don't like this anymore. I don't like that the railroad man's taking all my money. I don't like that I'm in debt to all these people in my city. I don't like that I don't know how much money I'm going to have. I never wanted to work in a factory, but I know that in the factory I'll be working X hours a day, right? 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I know that I'm going to have this much money. So there was this notion that industrial work would be at least steady. That turned out to be elusive, yeah, born of myth, but that was the factor that brought some people back from the farm to the factory. Yeah. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just like, economic determinism. A lot of people, like, some of you who are, listening to or watching this, you know, people move to cities for the same reason that we like cities. You know, they like shopping and art galleries and concerts and, you know, libraries and educational institutions, right? Rural America just couldn't compete with, Macy's or Marshall Fields or, KaDeWe, right? Like, I don't go to department stores, I don't go to malls really, but, like, you got to imagine that, like, you're a farmer and, like, all you smell all day is, like, s you know, basically pig poo, right? And then, like, and your landscape, I mean, it's beautiful, but it doesn't really change. It changes with the seasons, I suppose, but that's not the point. You walk down a city street in 1900, you can go window shopping, and, like, you have to imagine, like, what it would be like to walk into a Marshall Fields, a Macy's, a KaDeWe for the first time, and the smell of the perfumes. My gosh, and it's just like this endless stream of man's worldly goods, and people are, they find that alluring, they find that exciting. They wanted to, like, be part of, like, American capitalism. They wanted to buy and spend and compete, and that was really exciting to some people. So some people came to the city for that. Some people came because they were, like, interested in, the entertainment value of cities. I mean, just sitting on a bench, I mean, every day I take my daughter to the playground, I sit on the bench in Kreuzberg, and I just watch people. It is endlessly amusing. And while, sitting on the chair and watching cows, I guess, can be entertaining for a while, I don't know. It's not for me. I mean, I'm all about cows so long as they're on my plate. I don't know. I guess cows are all right, but that's not the point. The point is people came to the city because they wanted the bread and circus of it all. Like, literally, the Barnum and Bailey Circus was established at this time to entertain people in cities. It was also a traveling circus. But some people, and I would say a lot of people, I don't know what proportion of them, they came to cities because, yeah, cities were hard and rough in a lot of ways, but you had things like electricity. Yeah. I like electricity. You know what I love? I love indoor plumbing. I lived without it once. Yeah. When I lived in Uzbekistan. It's a nightmare to not have indoor plumbing. I'll spare you the details, but like, just imagine your world without it and then think, maybe that's a good reason to move to more urban environments. So just having modern technology, you think about like, you know, just having like uh reliable internet access. I got a buddy who just, bought like a cottage. He's trying to escape Chicago, so he bought a cottage for his family, a pandemic cottage out in the middle of Wisconsin. The internet there is ridiculous. He can't even do his work, and so like so that's sort of like the 21st century version of these types of amenities, and that pulls people to cities. Yeah. So these are some pull factors that brought people to cities, but they came despite the shame. And I want to talk to you about the shame of cities. And the shame of cities was illustrated splendidly by the so-called muckrakers. Now I know that we have something you know, of a rag at our school called the muckraker. The muckraker is actually it's an American term coined by Teddy Roosevelt, who used the term in a 1906 speech, where he's basically talking about the people who they rake the muck, they pull up the dirt on politicians who are corrupt, about business people who engage in corrupt practices or who, abuse their labors or who dump their toxic stew into the rivers. Right. The muckraker is supposed to serve this watchdog function where, novelists and journalists, social critics, they expose the corruption in Gilded Age America. And they started magazines, many of which are still with us today. Harper's Magazine, still great magazine. The Nation, still a great magazine. The Atlantic, I'm a subscriber, right? These muckraking magazines in the second printing revolution went to great lengths to illustrate how shameful cities had become. They became dens of corruption and despair. Yeah. They lacked transparency and rule of law. So this is sort of the duality of the city. Cities are exciting, full of opportunity, alluring for oh so many ways, but they are also grotesque, right? And the muckrakers try to capitalize on the opportunities and to expose the grotesqueness of it all. Yeah. The term shame of cities was sort of a socialist term. And one thing that socialists were particularly desperate to create was like a more appropriate housing stock. These cities just blew up, like out of nowhere. You saw the numbers, right? These cities, they were being built, like a city a minute in America. It was like China today, right? Every time you sneeze, a new city for 1 million people or more emerges in China, and that was America 100 years ago. And this Danish photographer Jacob Riis used the new flash bulb, which had just been invented, um, to um, to expose, pun intended, the shame of cities. And he shared some of his best photographs in this photo book that he is titled "How the Other Half Lives," and we see some of the photos here. I want to share a couple of Jacob Riis photos. They're really splendid. Um, and innovative for the time photos of American cities. Yeah. Um, this is a Reese photo of American housing. These are row houses. I think it's obvious why they're called row houses. You see these in New York a lot. You also see in New York a lot tenements, sometimes called dumbbell tenements. Let me show you. You can see why they're called dumbbell tenements. It's not because the people who lived in them were dumb. It's because they're sort of shaped like dumbbells. Like if you can grab the handle by the hall, right, and the courtyard. Um, so, and imagine these sort of like, stacked on top of each other. You have this fire escape out the back. I'll show you some images of like, courtyard life and fire escapes. Um, and you have here, a 10-foot by 10-foot room, an 11 by 14-foot room, and this would be the apartment. You walk in, this is your 6 by 9 foyer. Here is your living room, and then you have the bedroom in the back, right? You have probably a shared kitchen here, and then when they sort of retrofitted these, and you have a small kitchen here, and you know these were really small apartments, and you would have sometimes two, three, four families living in them. Here's an example. This is probably one of those like 11 by 14-foot rooms, and you have, I don't know what we have here. I can't even count, like six people. And like, there's two ways you could look at this photo, right? Like, look at the squalor and the misery of that. But to me, like, there's some, and that's true. Like this is, vermin and disease, and it's a mess. But it's also exciting. Like, these are people who are trying to live, dare I say, the American dream. These are people who are making great sacrifices so that they could try to make it. These are people who, like, they're living communally. And no, they don't have single family homes in the suburbs. And no, their lives aren't ideal by any standard. But these people have stories, and they have lives. And there was something dehumanizing about the whole effort. And I'm not going to deny that at all. Right, I want to commemorate that, if anything. They're still human. As dehumanizing as the conditions were, everyone in this room has a story, and Jacob Riis, through the photos, tries to tell that story. This guy has a story. So whereas these people are living on top of each other, this dude's like living in a cellar space alone, and he looks exhausted. And flash photography allowed Jacob Riis to get that photo. What a nightmare. Who knows what happened to this guy? I'd love to know. For all I know, he went on to be a CEO or a congressperson, or just like, you know, a happy father of six somewhere. But right now, he's paying his dues in an effort to live the American dream. I don't know if his dreams came true. And this woman is less alone. Here she is in squalor and filth, despite her best efforts, I'm sure, with an infant. And she's sort of like looking exhausted, like every new parent, I suppose. It's a powerful image. Here are kids playing in the courtyard of the dumbbell tenement. Laundry's hanging above. You got in that picture, what, eight kids, kind of posing, milling about, just playing with rocks, right? Playing with shards of wood, playing with cement. If you're lucky, you have a ball, and the kids compete to throw it against the wall. And you could look at that and be like, that's like an American favela. It's a ghetto. That's fine, and that's the shame of cities. But these kids are real kids. And you know what? They had fun. They had lives. And so we can criticize American cities, and we should, right? But like, we want to maintain the humanity of those who had that experience. Here's a bohemian cigar maker working at home with his family all day, every day, rolling them. Yeah. Jacob Riis said, all life eventually accommodates itself to its environment. Human life is no exception, right? We all adapt. But the slum is the measure of civilization. I love that. We can judge a culture, just it's one lens. We can judge a culture by how it treats the most vulnerable members of its society. And the slum is sort of a proxy for that. Yeah. Another sort of shameful thing about the cities was transportation. You had innovations in mass transit. You had streetcars in San Francisco in the 1870s. This is an image of that. Pretty cool. By the late 1890s, you had subways in Boston. But most of the urban transportation lines weren't built to get people around the city. They were built to get people out of the city to the new suburbs where the wealthy escaped to. That is the shame of it. You have a shameful water supply. Beer was, uh, safer than water, which explains the alcoholism that was so pervasive in the 1890s and the aughts and why we needed arguably prohibition. 2% beer was, we drank 2% beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because it was safer than water. Yeah. Um, the urban waterworks were built in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, but then, millions of people, tens of millions of people came to America. They settled in the cities. The waterworks couldn't handle them. And so you had massive typhoid and cholera outbreaks. Filtration systems were experimented with in the 1870s and 80s, which reduced some of the nastiness of it all. And then in 1908, the chlorination process was introduced, which really helped to make water potable. Yeah. So that was shameful. The water supply and the sanitation supply, you know, both in terms of individual and family contributions to sewage, but also animal contributions to sewage, and also corporate and company contributions to sewage, right? Like, the sewage system was a mess, factory pollution was a nightmare, and the trash collection, um, firms were all wrapped up in mobs. In Chicago, especially in Boston and New York, trash collection was done, by the mafia. And so a lot of people, to get their trash taken out would have to pay the boss, and as we'll talk about later in this lecture, that type of crime and corruption was really daunting. So you have things like this, a Jacob Riis photo of kids just playing in the filthy gutters with a dead horse. I mean, that's sad, right? I mean, of course, all dead animals are sad, but that's not the point. Horses die. There, everything dies. Okay, kids? But it's sad because, like, don't these kids have anything other to do than, like literally, like, go play in the gutters? That's what my father used to say to me, sort of half joking, like, "You don't got anything, you go play in the gutters for a while." These are kids playing in the gutters, and they're, like, poking a dead horse. But, like, this is their childhood, and this is their life, and, they were just little street urchins that ran around. They were free. And so while I feel bad for these kids, they obviously didn't have, access to the best healthcare or education in the world, let's assume. Yeah. They had a freedom that a lot of my students don't. They just ran around all the time, had fun, maybe caused some trouble, maybe poked a dead horse every once in a while. Anyway, these are some Jacob Riis photos that illustrate the so-called shame of cities. They illustrate, as Jacob Riis called it, how the other half lives. Yeah. The cities were plagued quite regularly with fire. This is in part because the aforementioned limited water supply and the sewage problems. It's in part because a lot of buildings weren't equipped with electricity. And when they were, the electricity supply was, liquid and nasty and really flammable. You had a lot of buildings that were made out of wood. And I'm not an engineer, but I do believe wood burns a little more easily than steel frame construction buildings would. And you didn't really have established fire departments. They were usually volunteer fire services. The turning point in this was in my fair city in 1871. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed 17,000, 18,000 buildings. Um, Interestingly enough, until basically today, the myth was that Miss O'Leary, right, this Irish woman, Miss O'Leary went out with a kerosene lamp to milk her cow to get morning milk, and then she accidentally tipped that kerosene lamp, which set off the Chicago fire. So the Chicago fire was blamed on this woman called Miss O'Leary because she was Irish, and the Irish were not the apple of the eye of the American people. It's all a myth, but I was told that. I was taught that myth when I was growing up. Miss O'Leary, in fact, had nothing to do with it. Her name shall not live in infamy any longer. But cities went up in flames. And yeah, there are also natural disasters like the San Francisco earthquake. But one of this fire one of these fires, it was a turning point, and it's a little bit out of the scope of this lecture, which seeks to focus on 1870 to 1900. But in 1911 in Manhattan, there was the deadliest industrial disaster in the history of the United States. 146 garment workers, most of whom were women, went up in flames or had to jump from the fifth story window of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Yeah. These were young Eastern European and Southern European people who burned to death because the cities weren't maintaining codes. Like anyone could just build a building. Like, in Berlin, it takes forever to build a building. It takes forever to get permits. And it's all very slow. And like we see how slowly construction happens. And you look at China, like they just built a city in a month, and it took us, at the York Strasse S1 stop, they've been doing a construction project to build an escalator for 18 months. It's an 18-month escalator project, and that's ridiculous. But I'm 100% certain that's going to be the most effective, reliable escalator. I have zero fear that anyone's going to die on that escalator from, faulty escalator construction. Yeah. So there weren't fire codes, and where there were fire codes, they were enforced by mobs who took payoffs to just there were no codes. So like, for example, just like, at the Kennedy School, if you want to get out of a door, if you're in the classroom and get out the door, you push the door out. You don't do it so like the door pulls in, because the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, despite the codes, all the doors pulled in, but there was a fire. Everyone was trying to get out. So what happened is people, ended up, lined up against the door, and they just burned to death. They're suffocated. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, because of how magnificently horrible it was, led to more regulations in more cities. And the 146 people who died, they they uh, they died not in vain, because it was a turning point in regulation, which made cities less shameful. You know, cities were dens of crime, right? Fire, fire and crime. Right? You had organized crime and, even worse, disorganized crime. Here's a Reese photo of a bunch of mafiosos in New York. Gang violence, violent crime, prostitution, gambling. Yeah. And most cities didn't have organized fire or police forces. And when they did develop police forces, a lot of them became mob adjacent. I think I just invented that term, mob adjacent. I like it. I'm going to try to remember it. Yeah. So cities, the urbanization process is really complicated. It's robust, changes the face of America. It was paradoxically shameful and fantastic and admirable. Its cities are large; they contain multitudes, and I'm here to not, adjudicate the value of cities per se, but it was a revolutionary process. Right? Urbanization is a revolutionary process. Industrialization is a revolutionary process, right? They call it the Industrial Revolution. It's an urban revolution. And these revolutionary processes had an impact on class and gender. First, I want to talk about class, right? New class distinctions emerged and became more pronounced by the turn to the 20th century. We had a new uber wealthy bourgeoisie, the nouveau riche class. By 1890, the top 12% of American families controlled 86% of the wealth. The bottom half of families controlled 1% of the wealth, right? It's not that different than what we see today. The difference today is that there's just so much more wealth. And while the wealth concentrations in America today are, I don't know, borderline criminal, certainly suboptimal. Yeah. Um, More Americans have more access to wealth. There is a bigger middle class today than there was, 130 years ago. So you have this new class of Rockefellers and Carnegies and Vanderbilts. They didn't exist before. You have a middle class, an upper middle class of doctors and lawyers. lower middle class of salespeople, some like government workers, right? Um, and teachers, middle class, lower middle class. That's me. I'm lower middle class. And while there is a lower middle class, I am in it. And most of the middle class was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or WASPs. The working class, you had sort of like an upper working class at the top, the like mechanics, skilled workers, and then you had miners and railroad workers at the bottom of the working class. A lot of the working class was Catholic, Southern and Southeastern European, African American. It's important to note that while the unemployment rate in this time varied fantastically, right? You have the 1873 economic panic, you have the crash of 1893, but unemployment rates usually hovered around 10 to 15% at any given time. But also at any given time, 25 to 30% of the workforce was unemployed during some time that year. So work was really unsteady. Yeah, you couldn't rely on being employed for an entire year, even in the industrial urban workforce. And it's important to note that at the turn of the century, about 20% of children under the age of 15 worked outside of the farm, right? So the 20% child labor stat isn't like kids who are working on the farm, milking the cows and like, messing around in the fields and, picking some cotton or picking some wheat. I'm talking about kids working in coal mines. I'm talking about kids working in factories. I'm talking about kids doing piecework, rolling cigars at home. So we have a real child labor problem. Yeah. And about 1 in 5 urban women worked outside of the home. Now, just to be clear, there's tons of work to be done in the home, right? The homemaker job is a very real job, and it's particularly real when you don't have a washing machine, you don't have a dishwasher, have not 1 or 2 kids, but 5 or 7 kids or 9 kids. You don't have a vacuum cleaner, you don't have any of these amenities. So it was real work, but I just want to talk about women working outside of the home. So this is a focus on gender, the impact of urbanization and immigration on gender. Um, Now postulated that it was generally the case that women who had the means not to work, they usually didn't. When middle upper class and upper class women did work, they tended to work as social workers, as teachers. They tended to work in ways that they could give back. Yeah. Um, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But just some data. In 1900, 6% of married women worked outside of the home. Okay. Now, I should put an asterisk on that. Again, women worked assiduously inside the home to take care of families. That is indeed a full-time job. Uh, but also a lot of women, in addition to tending to their families, they would do what we call piecework. They would have, for example, garments, uh, uh, cloth sent to their house, and then they would sew and get paid by the piece. That's why they called it piecework. And so they were working in the home, sort of like while keeping half an eye on the kids and the stew on the stove. Okay. 70% of the labor force was female. 5 million women worked for wages in 1900, and 45% of single women worked. Okay. So 6% of married women worked outside the home. 45% of single women worked. And so it's important that we understand that, there is a, a, um, a robust history with millions and millions of stories of women working and women working outside of the home, before the gender revolution of the 60s and 70s. Okay. This idea that women didn't work before the 60s is just so dead wrong. Women worked. Women worked inside the home. Women worked outside of the home. Women contributed to American economic largesse. We can't erase that history. Yeah. So 45% of single women worked. 20% of those worked in textiles. So the garment industry, which was a nightmare. and 40% of women worked as domestic servants. And it's worth thinking about, like, if you were a woman in 1900, which would you rather do? Would you rather work in a textile mill, with the smoke and the heat and the danger, but you get to work with other women, you get to leave the home, get away from the kids. Yeah, at the risk of your life, right? Or would you rather be a domestic servant, um, taking care of other people's kids, maybe kind of isolated, you know? So I don't know. I don't know which one you'd rather do. It's worth thinking about. I don't want to do either, but that's me. I guess it's there's my male privilege. I don't want to do either, so I'm not going to. So you had a hierarchy of female women at the top. You had WASP women, the women that would like clerk at a store, or telephone operators, like jobs you didn't get dirty at. That's a way to put it. There's a way to put it. Being a secretary, they wouldn't hire an Irish woman to be a secretary. Like you wouldn't want that. Some Irish accent. Remember, these are people who are seen to be somehow subhuman. Yeah. Below the secretaries and the clerks were factory workers, um, and some of them unionized at the turn of the century. And at the bottom, you have domestic servants, a lot of Irish women, a lot of African American women. You don't have a union when you're a domestic servant. Yeah. You don't have any job protections. If they say, we'll be home by 6 o'clock, and they don't get home at 8 o'clock, there's nothing you could do about it. You don't get to call the union. You don't get to leave. You can't leave the kids alone. That means that your kids just have to suffer without you. Being a domestic servant is nightmarish. But there is this interesting sort of like narrative about like the African American woman and the Irish woman. While they were seen to be somehow lesser, they were seen to be like better parents, right? Like this trope of like, the African American quote unquote mammy who can like take care of kids, and they'll whip the kids in line because they're like, black and strong like that, right? Or the Irish woman who, she must be able to take care of kids because, she probably had 9 little, siblings when she grew up. So she's a better, yeah, she's gonna be a better domestic servant. So like, there's all of this like, ethno-religious and racial bigotry that goes into this, calculus to make black and Irish women do domestic servitude, because like people had to be able to justify like, you have a black person in your home. Yeah, of course. Like that black women are great at raising kids, right? It's also twisted, isn't it? So that's like some thoughts on class and gender, the impact of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration on class and gender. And so there were naturally reactions to that. So like if you want to pause at all, like if you're watching this as a video, this would be a good time to pause. I'll pause. I'm gonna have some water. All right. So this is a picture of Jane Addams, Chicago hero. I want to talk about the reactions to urbanization and immigration. All right. Talk about social reform. Who are the reformers? What did they want? Well, most of them were middle-class whites. A lot of them were women. Many were informed and inspired by the muckrakers. And they had a lot of concerns about immigration, the shame of cities, the corruption of big business. They wanted direct democracy, right? At this time, you couldn't vote for your senator still. Um, they wanted referendums and recall initiatives. We'll talk about that when we get to progressivism. They wanted women to have the right to vote. My gosh. Eventually, they achieved that. They wanted to eliminate or reduce child labor. They wanted to change the tax code so that the rich paid a higher percentage. They wanted to deal with labor unrest and to reduce crime and corruption in cities. These were the social reformers. What do they want? And, well, a lot of them just wanted to Americanize the immigrants. So you had a whole host of like non-governmental organizations like the YMCA, or the Young Women's Christian Association, the Young Men's Christian Association. You had labor unions, the Knights of Columbus, chambers of commerce, to try to like teach people to speak English and to read American English and to learn about democracy, or republicanism, as it were. Yeah, to learn that George Washington is a hero, and some people never tell lies. Learn how to cook American, like learn how to like put bologna on the thing called Wonder Bread. I guess that came later. And just like learn the etiquette of Americanism. We don't call people sir, we call people Mister, right? We don't use a fork and a knife. We use a fork as a shovel, and we shovel food in our mouths, right? Like that's how we do it in America, right? Like different sorts of, you say to people, you say like, "Hey, how you doing?" Even though you don't care, right? These are types of things that these Americanization warriors were trying to instill upon the new immigrants. It's like how to be American, yeah. And one way and one place that people learn to be American is through the churches. And to their credit, the churches stepped in where, urban governments fell prey to like crime and corruption, and selfishness. In the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and ever since, a lot of churches decided that in addition to preparing people for the afterlife, which if you're a believer is obviously important, it's eternity, my gosh. Churches also have a justice function. They should try to reduce poverty and alcoholism and crime and racial tension and slum life. They should, churches should function to, yes, like, promote faith, evangelize, bring more people behind the pearly gates. But until then, like, get kids out of the coal mines and educate them in decent schools. This is a very pure motivation. This is decency. It's about service. Yeah. There's a lot of solace that one can have in like service. But it was also because of the fear that if not, that the socialists and the anarchists would take over and they're going to burn the churches. Right. So like there was a lot of motivation for the churches to change their role in American society. And so the places like Salvation Army and the YMCA and the Moody Bible Institute were established to try to, make churches charitable places, which of course is laudable and beautiful and um, to be respected. So many churches did so much to keep uh, American children safe, giving sanctuary. I mean, to this day, churches are involved in soup kitchen projects and providing shelter to women who face abuse and children who face abuse and neglect, right? Um, and this all sort of began in an American context in the 1880s and 90s. Yeah. In a really substantial way. I think churches have always, to some degree, served that function, but they really doubled and tripled down on that effort in this era. Um, and outside of the church purview, you had the settlement house movement, which worked alongside churches in many ways, to try to build on the successes of the Toynbee Hall in England and Stanton Hall in New York, where like well-to-do Northeastern, Middle Western women devoted their time to volunteerism. They would go to reform houses, which I'll show you what that means in a second. And they would like teach people not just how to be American, but like how to thrive in America. Yeah. So women became politicized. Like men were dragged into the factory. They were working insane hours with whatever time they had left. They might have been involved in, trying to unionize, or they were just getting drunk at the bar. Maybe they were doing both. You can do both at once. Um, and women really took on a more active political role. So one thing you see as an impact of industrialization, immigration, and urbanization is the evolving role and the increasing role of women in American political and cultural life. And one woman I just want to talk about because she's a bit of a hometown hero is Jane Addams, the one of the founders, along with Ellen Gates Starr, of Hull House in 1889 in Chicago. St. Jane, they actually just named a chunk of the highway after her, the Jane Addams Expressway in Chicago, which I think is just awesome. I think it was hard to do that for a long time because she was an avowed socialist, but the Cold War is over and St. Jane is getting her place. She and her colleagues at Hull House taught immigrants how to, take care of their children in an American context, how to speak English, how to, discuss, politics in America. And she was an advocate of the three R's: residence, research, and reform. Yeah. So someone who's listening to this live is unmuted and making some noise. Thanks. So people lived at Hull House. It was indeed a house. It was a place for research, and it was a place to promote social reform. And in order to achieve, these goals of the reform movement, it required, quote, the close cooperation with the neighborhood people, scientific study of the causes of poverty and dependence, communication of all these facts from these studies to the public, and persistent pressure for legislative and social reform. This is Jane Addams, whose name I misspelled accidentally at the bottom of the slide, writing in the Forum magazine. It's becoming a neighborhood activist, watching what's going on, you know, defeating poverty, defeating dependence, creating a class of urban Americans who could thrive. To do that, Hull House, and this is an image of it, inside and out, established a free daycare system. Yeah. And when a parent would drop off the kid, they would get a meal. The kids would get a meal. The first free kindergarten in America, I believe. You had a boys' club. Get these boys off the street. You don't want them hanging out playing with dead horses. Come on in. Learn how to play cards. Learn the skill. Here's a wood shop for you. Yeah. Here, come on. Let's all go get ice cream and talk about politics. Let's play an organized sport. Got to get boys off the street. Young men are dangerous. I know. I was one. Right. And so Hull House got some of the boys off the street. Did that sound sexist? Okay, young women are dangerous too. Maybe that's true. I'm sure it's true. Everyone's dangerous. But like unemployed, unwatched young men can present a certain trouble to society. I hope I can get away with saying that. So they would and old men at the bar, I could tell you from experience, can create some troubles too. So, Hull House had a coffee shop. Instead of men going out to the bar, they could come in for free coffee and talk about the events of the day, maybe in their native tongue, maybe in English. Yeah. You had the first public playgrounds in Chicago outside and around Hull House, and you had programs for people who came to America, and many of them were isolated and alone, and there was a medical clinic there. So this is St. Jane. This is Hull House. This is a reaction to immigration, industrialization, and urbanization. These are people just like you and I. St. Jane is not a saint. She's just a person, and she devoted her life to trying to help people in need in the city of Chicago. And so we look to her and Ellen Gates Starr and others, who, instead of just sitting around and reading a book, which I firmly advocate, or in addition to just sitting around and reading a book, you know, they they were volunteers. They gave of themselves and they made cities less shameful places. Yeah. I want to talk more about Jane Addams. She's awesome. She got the Nobel Peace Prize. She's the best. But I want to be mindful of your time. Okay. So there is a question about the ways in which the efforts of people like Jane Addams and the women of the International Garment Workers Union were reformists or, um, more of like a socialist threat, right? And a lot of the efforts to try to promote reform use the language of socialism. And of course, that's to be expected because a lot of people who were coming to America at the time, Germans, Italians, some of the Jewish immigrants, they were interested in socialist and anarchist thought. And of course, America is ripe with these sort of utopian ideals. Going back to the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, we talked about, the age of reform. So there is like a history of socialist thought in America. And the 1870s, 80s, and 90s really presented a socialist challenge. I have listed for you a number of um, labor unions that were established. We already read the other Civil War, and we were talking about um, the socioeconomic challenge that labor unions and workers collectives presented. Um, and there was a real fear that the unions were socialist and socialism was going to take over, right? And there were violent struggles about which we've read, more of which we'll hear about. You did have socialist mayors, not just progressive, but socialist mayors of major American cities. Eugene Debs was the four-time candidate for president from the Socialist Party, and in 1920 he won 1 million votes for president from prison. He was imprisoned, as we'll soon see, for speaking out against World War I as something inhumane and unnecessary for American participation. Yeah. So we'll talk about in a forthcoming lecture how the progressive era played a role in reducing the socialist impulses that were rising in America. And we'll talk about the Red Scare of 1919 to 21, and then the more substantial Red Scare of, call it 1945 to to present, I guess, and anti-socialist, anti-communist hysteria. But that's that for now. Okay. So I guess just to make a clear point, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the reform movements emerged both out of a hope to help people, but also out of the fear that if American cities were not made more safe, and that if the shame of the cities was not somehow mitigated, that America could become like a hotbed of revolutionary socialism. Yeah. Okay. I think I made that point. I hope I made that point. All right. So if you're going to take a break, now would be a good time to do it before we go from sort of non-governmental organization reactions to industrialization, immigration, to the politics of the Gilded Age. And this is where we return to Rockefeller holding the White House. All right. So what I'm going to talk about is the political reactions to revolutionary industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. Okay. And this took the form of political machines. During the Gilded Age, a lot of American cities, Northern American cities in particular, were run by political machines. Kansas is an outlier. Kansas City was run by Boss Pendergast, who was a corrupt fool, really. The machine was controlled by a boss, sometimes the mayor, sometimes not, and his political party in New York, which we'll focus in on. It was the Democratic Party who controlled the Tammany Hall political machine. Yeah. And were the Americanizers, right? The nativists, the American Protective Association, the Salvation Army, yeah, the settlement house movement and the reformers failed. Political machines offered services to voters and to businesses in exchange for political or financial support. So I think that's kind of like a textbook definition of what political machines are. Yeah. Political machines offer services to voters and businesses in exchange for political support. So in that way, political machines, it's just politics. Like that's what democratic politics is in a way, offering services to voters in exchange for votes. Yeah. But the political machine is much more corrupt and lacking in transparency. It's much more nefarious than the definition might intimate. So let's talk about what political machines are, what they achieved, but also at the expense at which they achieved it. The political machine was organized with the boss on top, the ward bosses, the precinct captains, and precinct workers below that. So, for those of you not in the know, most major American cities are subdivided into precincts. You know, um, maybe a precinct is 20 city blocks by 10 city blocks, something like that. And then the precincts, maybe there's 10 precincts to a ward, and maybe there's, you know, 30 or 50 or 100 wards in the city. So you have, right, you have the country, then you have the state, and the state, in the state you have counties, and then in some counties you have cities, and then the city is broken down into wards and precincts. Okay. So that's how it's kind of, that's how the machine, that's a hierarchy of the machine. All right, just so we're speaking the same language. The machine was run by bosses, and the boss was the boss. They ran business, they ran politics, they ran education and infrastructure. They had their hands in every pot. The boss controls who can, get municipal jobs, coveted municipal jobs, like who gets work as a garbage collector, who gets work as a teacher, who gets work as an administrator, who gets work, in government buildings, who gets work as a librarian, who gets alcohol license, who gets construction permits. Yeah. And in order to get these things in New York, for example, you had to be a loyal Democrat. You had to show up and vote for the Tweed machine year after year after year. These bosses had an undue influence over the courts. There was no rule of law. There was a class of politicians who were decidedly and in every way, shape, and form above the law. And they were above the law in part because they were able to gain an unquestioningly loyal voter base. They basically traded jobs for votes. And it's corrupt. That's not democracy at its finest. Although people have argued the contrary, um, it's not, democracy at its finest because it denies the opposition opportunities, right? And because it could be ethno-religiously or racially exclusive, right? But through providing jobs to people for loyalty, they were able to build waterworks and roads and parks and schools and all of the things that make cities happen. So they were inherently corrupt, but they built the cities. And like, look, I come from Chicago. I come from, the Democratic Party. The Democratic machine has controlled urban politics in America for, generations. And it's not as corrupt as it was, but when the Daley machine ran it, so this is, there were two Daleys, father and son. It's more than just folklore, myth, and legend. It was, it was an Irish political machine that ran the city for 50 years. And Richard J. Daley, the father, is the stuff of, is the stuff of movies, really. And I could tell you a million stories, but I'm not going to put them on record. Not out of fear for my life, but out of fear for my life. Okay. So the bosses ran the cities, and the machine, the fuel for the machine, was the immigrants. Yeah. And a lot of the precinct captains were immigrants, whether they were first or second generation immigrants. You know, they spoke the language of the immigrants, literally and metaphorically. And they would help them to find jobs. They would help them to find a place to live. They would help them to, get loans or business licenses, or when they needed them, lawyers. So I want you to think about like an immigrant family that comes to New York in 1885 or something, right? And they got a letter from their cousin, you should come to America, there's so many opportunities here, you know the life in life in Milan is a nightmare, get out of there, it's the political unrest, the anarchists are killing people, I've read about what's going on, come to America, at least it's safe here, it's not perfect, but I'll get you a job, I promise. And you get that letter, and this guy, we'll call him Mario because I want to, and Mario got his letter from his cousin. He looked at it every day. He's like, I want to go to America, I want to go to America, honey, let's go to America. And somehow or another, they get their 6 kids in tow, and they get on a boat and they go across the Atlantic, and they show up and they see the Statue of Liberty, and like they cry and they hug, and "Oh my god, we made it!" And they get off the boat and they go through the indignity of being processed at Ellis Island, and they're standing in line, and people are coughing, and people have smallpox and cholera and typhoid, and people are throwing up, and they get off the boat and they're falling down, and people are sick, and but they get through the processing center, and they get there and they look around like, we're in America. It's powerful, but it's problematic. Yeah. Because they don't have Google Maps. They don't know where to go. There's no telephones. They got to find their way. Mario's got to find his cousin, whose name is Luigi, of course, because, come on. And, his, why am I doing this? Okay. But his cousin Luigi says, all right, I live on, 655, 2nd Street, 2nd Avenue, 52nd Street. I live on 52nd Street, And, and so they go to 655 2nd Street, and they knock on the door. They're looking, they're rapping on the door of this big tenement house, and it's like, "Hey, where's Luigi?" And like nobody knows who Luigi is. And then finally, some old lady says, "Oh, Luigi and his family, they moved out a month ago. Sorry, you missed them." And then invariably, like when they're in the neighborhood, this Italian neighborhood, there will be a guy who's going to come up to him. "Hey, I don't recognize you. Are you new to the neighborhood?" "Yeah, yeah, then the guy only speaks Italian. Mario only speaks Italian, and then this guy comes up to him, starts speaking Italian with him also, and he's like, "Oh, cool, you speak Italian too?" And they speak in their native tongue together. And he says, "Well, I don't know where Luigi is, but can I help you somehow?" And Mario's like, "Yes, please. 3 of my kids are crying. One of them passed out of my arm. I can't carry him anymore. My wife feels sick. I feel sick. We just want a place to sleep for the night. Do you know of a hotel?" He goes, better yet, "I got a friend who owns an apartment building and they just had a vacancy. Why don't you move in there for a week or two? You pay by the week, you know, and I'll get you in there for a week." He's like, "Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much. You're a savior." This is me, speaking in Italian, of course. You know, totally saving my family here. Yeah, take me there. And they walk together and they talk and they share stories of life in Milan. This guy happens to have like an aunt from Milan. He's got a friend from Milan, and they they go to this apartment building, and this guy who they never met before, he raps on the door. Everybody seems to know him, and he comes in. He goes, "Here's your apartment. I just negotiated. You can stay here for a week for free until you get a job. You got a job, I assume." "No, I don't have a job." "You don't have a job, Mario?" "Ah, Luigi told me you'd give me a job, but like I don't know where he is. I don't know where I'm going to work. I don't know what I'm going to do. This is kind of a nightmare. I thought the streets were paved with gold. They're not." Yeah. So this guy says, I know a guy who's looking for he's looking for workers. He owns a textile factory, and you can work there, and it's not the best job in the world, but it'll pay for this place for a week at a time. Okay, let me take you over. Let me you show up here. He writes down the address, piece of paper. Tell him that I sent you, and bring this piece of paper with, and you'll have a job. Don't mess it up. Okay. And the family, the mom and the dad, they're crying tears of joy. Everyone in America is so kind. They're so beautiful. I can't believe they're doing this. And he said, "Oh, I appreciate your happy tears, but this story wouldn't be complete if we didn't go pray over it. So let's go down. There's a Latin mass happening at the church down the street. Let's go." So they go down the street. 2 block walk, and they're talking, they're sharing stories. It's amazing, right? They landed on their feet. The kindness of strangers, the serendipity of it all. He speaks Italian and everything, got a job. And then they enter a beautiful church, and they have a Latin mass, and you know, they have a wafer, a glass of wine. I don't know how these things work. And then they have some peace, and they all are about to go back into their new, humble, one-room abode. And the guy who did all this for him shakes his hand. He says, "Good luck with everything. I hope to see you around the neighborhood." And Mario says, "But like, who are you? Like, what can I do for you?" And the guy pulls out his calling card and he says, I represent the 24th precinct. My boss is William Tweed. He's, runs the Tammany Hall political machine. You know what I want you to do? You know, you can help me real easy. I want to get you registered to vote. And we got an election in November. I want you to vote Democratic straight down the ticket. You know what this Italian guy says? No problem. Of course, it's loyalty. I would. I'm not above that. If you did all that for me, I'd vote. I'd vote for you. And that's kind of how it worked. That's sort of a nice way to look at it. It's a nice story. There's other things that the machines did that were less palatable. Let's get into some of those. They use graft, right? You go to an urban planning committee, they'd be like, "Oh, we're going to build this road," and the next thing you know, you buy all the property alongside that road, so that when that road is built, you own the property, and then developers have to pay you. You know, that's graft. It's using your political influence, your insider knowledge for personal gain. Political machines use kickbacks, right? Oh, you want a job working at the Department of Motor Vehicles? Give me $100, I'll get you the job. You know, you want to, get your daughter a job as a teacher at this nice school? No problem. We'll get her hired. Give me $50. Or, you know, give me make sure you vote Democratic. Yeah. You want a gambling license? Here, we'll get you a gambling license. We'll take 10% off the top. Right. And there was no one to stop them because the cops were basically owned by the bosses. Okay. By the way, that was true in Chicago well into, the 1970s. You know, the cops were full on owned by the Daily Machine. You had to kiss that ring. You know. All right. So those are some of the tactics of political machines I want to talk about more, but particularly focusing on the Tweed ring. Boss Tweed was one of the most powerful political bosses in the United States. He was the head of the Tammany Hall political machine in New York. He was a member of the House of Representatives. He became, for a long time, for 22 years, he was, he moved back to New York. He became like a local power player. He served in the New York State Senate, and he got his buddies elected to office in New York, and they became the so-called Tweed Ring. It was a racket, yeah. And throughout the 1860s and 70s, they swindled New York City out of billions and billions of dollars. Let's say billions of dollars in modern money. I'll show you how. One thing they would do is they would like create fake leases and padded bills to get their buddies money and to get them money. So, for example, these are true, uh, um, this is true. These are true numbers. This is a true story. These are real. This is real data. That's what I'm struggling to say. You know, they bought 40 chairs, used chairs, and 3 tables for a building, a city building, for $180,000. $180,000. It's $2 million today for some chairs, right? So they get a receipt, they do it all right, but these chairs happen to cost $180,000, right? And then from like a furniture shop, and then the furniture shop sells it to them for $180,000, and then the guy who created that, negotiation, he gets half of it, right? You pay a carpenter, $370,000 for a month of work, 5 million bucks today. You pay the carpenter, this contractor, a ton of money, and then they pay you back on the back end. Yeah. So this was the type of fraud that the Tweed ring engaged in, and they got insanely rich. Yeah. Tweed himself bought a bunch of property in Harlem. He used city funds to develop it, to get roads and water systems going. And then he sold the property for 10, 20 times more than he bought it for. He himself, the boss, was the third largest property owner in New York. Yeah. When it was all said and done, and he left all these unfinished projects and he swindled the city out of a ton of cash, he had earned between the estimates range between 50 and 200 million. And I'll get into Terry Galway's book about it and some of the problems of determining how much. But in modern money, he swindled New York City out of between 365 million and 2.4 billion dollars today. He was a fraudster. He was a gangster. And every once in and every once in a while in American politics, the cream doesn't rise to the top, right? Every once in a while, the people elect someone who has no allegiance to the rules, who sees themselves as being above the law, and they see politics as a gangster's game, which to some degree it should be, but even gangsters have rules. But every once in a while, you get some guy who has no rules, no moral center. Yeah. There is no higher power to them. And Boss Tweed was one of those people. Yeah. He's a fraudster. This is the Tammany Hall building. Cost like $6 gazillion. By the time he was dead, it wasn't even finished. I don't know if that's true, by the way. Maybe it even existed before. Beautiful building, though. But that's the epicenter of all the fraud. Actually, I think that building, I'm looking at it, it might have existed before Tweed was even uh, the boss. Um, and one of the main ways, this is a caricature of Boss Tweed. He was overweight, but Thomas Nast, who we'll learn about, Thomas Nast always accentuated his robust waistline. Um, one of the ways that the machines worked was through fraud, right? You didn't then, as now, have to show ID to vote. People would shave and vote, shave and come back and vote again. Dogs would vote, dead people would vote, but it didn't matter ultimately because the political machine counted the votes. And here's Boss Tweed just being a gangster and counting their strength and standing in front of a ballot box. Yeah. And so sometimes in American history, some of these, gangster politician types, they might try to influence a vote. But I'm just talking about the 1870s and 80s, of course. These days, no one would, try to influence a ballot count. That's so 19th century. So because of, God, I never realized how much he sort of looks like Matthew Broderick. Huh. Because the Tweed ring, and there is William Mager Tweed. Because the Tweed ring was so corrupt and so grotesque, and as you'll see, because the Tweed ring catered to the Irish communities, which some found to be detestable, Thomas Nast, the man on the left, endeavored to take Tweed and the Tweed ring down, to expose the corruption of the machine. Yeah. Let me show you how. Oh, by the way, Nast was a cartoonist. Yeah. A cartoonist played a central role in bringing down the machine. Tweed was infuriated by these cartoons. He said, "Stop them damn pictures. I don't care so much about what the papers say about me. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damn pictures." Right? So maybe they could read, but they read Italian. Maybe they could read, or they read Slavic or whatever. There's some Slavic language. Yeah, they could read Russian. They could read Hebrew, whatever. German. But the pictures, man, they were really powerful. So let's talk about Thomas Nast's assault on the Tweed ring. Here is a cartoon he wrote. He penned called "Going Through the Universal Form of Suffrage." The caption, which you can't read on the image, says, "You have the liberty of voting for anyone you please, but we have the liberty of counting any way we please." And there's Tweed and his, minions behind him. These and there's the cop sleeping, right? Two legs on the floor, four legs off. Just the cops just chilling, watching the the electoral corruption. Yeah, this is a Tweed cartoon. Here's another one. Yeah, the brains of Tammany Hall. Yeah, Boss Tweed just got his mind on his money and his money on his mind. Who stole the people's money? Do tell 'twas him. And you have all of these, these working people, all the people engaged in the the graft and the kickbacks are all pointing to the next guy, pointing to the next guy, pointing to the next guy. And even Tweed's, right hand men are pointing to him. And he's just sitting there like, yep, I stole all the people's money. Yep, that's right. Yeah. Here is a colorized cartoon. There's Tweed and his boys in the background, the same menagerie of fools. The city treasury emptied to the working men and the four masters who emptied it. And here's the working class on the left. They just need some support from the government. Yeah. And there's the guys on the right, and they got, a huge ice bucket full of champagne, and they're, eating like kings, living the high life. And the working class is suffering. And at the top, Nast asks the question to the reader, what are you going to do about it? All of these cartoons were published in Harper's Magazine, again, one of the muckraking journals of the time, and again, one of my favorite magazines today, if for no other reason because of the Harper's Index. If you want to join me in one of my favorite things, one of my favorite simple pleasures, just Google Harper's Index. It's just a list of facts published in every edition. Okay, so Harper's cartoons, Nast. Right, the next cartoon. This is wholesale versus retail theft. Yeah. Um, and Tweed goes into the New York City Treasury, engages in wholesale theft, surrounded by his henchmen. The police, salute him as he walks out with all the money in the treasury. But a poor man walks into a bakery to steal a roll because he's starving, and the police beat the life out of him as people look on. Yeah. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? You have elite politicians and business people who are, you know, uh, uh, stealing from the American people, and they get away with it, or they pay fines or whatever, um, and then people who steal from Walmart, they go to jail. Yeah, um, and so this is Nast's effort to expose this sort of corruption and to condemn the the misappropriation of law. Yeah, it's a powerful cartoon, as is this one. There's Tweed. Can the law reach him? The dwarf and the giant thief, right? You have the state prison in the background, and you know, Tweed's too big for prison. And even if the police wanted to try to take Tweed down, he's too big. And even if the police wanted to take Tweed down, he's too busy because he has one hand tied behind his back, taking care of the little criminals, the petty thieves, the drug dealers, and the small time gangsters, and the thieves, and the people who are stealing bread from the bakery. The cops are too busy taking care of small time crime to touch the big guys. And truth be told, even if you had more police, right, and they weren't so busy focusing on the pickpockets and the coke dealers, they're outsized. Tweed was a larger than life character, the dwarf and the giant thief. Powerful image from Thomas Nast and Harper's Magazine. But this is my favorite one. And it was a double spread. You could see if you look closely, it's on like two sides of a magazine, right? Page one, page two, or whatever. And this was published on the eve of the 1871 New York City elections. And I have to explain this cartoon a bit because I failed to mention that the Tammany Hall ring had a mascot, and that mascot was the tiger. Yeah. And there's the Tammany tiger, and you can barely even recognize it. But he attacks Lady Liberty. That's Lady Liberty. And he's gotten her down. He's looking straight at the camera. He's going to kill her. He's going to bite her head off. And there in this, you know, um, Roman Colosseum, right? Of course, Rome falling, having something to do with endemic corruption in the Republic. There in the background, but for the grace of God, is Tweed just watching on. He's like, go ahead. Do it. Kill her. Kill Lady Liberty. Yeah. So this was published like right before the election. This is Nast's effort to try to influence the 1871 election. It's a beautiful cartoon. Remember that tiger. We'll come back to the tiger. Yeah. I could look at it all day. So Tweed, because he was so scared of these pictures and the effect it would have on his constituents, he sent someone to, inform Nast that that his love, that his work was loved in Europe, right? And that there was a like an NGO that wanted to bring Thomas Nast to Europe to show his amazing cartoons to the Italians, and you should, go to Rome and and you can and you'll be treated like a king. They love art there. And Nast is like, yeah, I'm not sure if this is quite real. They were just trying to get him out of the country, right? Um, and then he's like, nah, no thanks. I don't think I want to go to Europe to show my work. And like, oh, we'll give you $100,000, right? This opportunity comes with $100,000. And Nasta's like, nah, I think I need more than that to leave my family and to leave my job at Harper's. I'm like, we'll give you $500,000. Kids, I don't know if you realize that's an insane amount of money. Yeah. I mean, it's insane today. Imagine that amount of money, millions and millions of dollars, $20 million. I don't know how much it would be. A ton of money. And he said, nah, I'd rather see you all in jail. He knew what was going on. And then the guy who came and said, be careful, Mr. Nast, that you don't find yourself in a coffin. Yeah. And next thing you know, there were people standing outside of his house, just lurking like gangsters. So he did the thing that no decent New Yorker wants to do, and he moved to Morristown, New Jersey. Yeah. Because his family wasn't safe. They were going to kill him. He had every reason to think, you know, that his family was going to be killed, by the Tweed ring. Yeah. But he was courageous and he continued to write cartoons. Yeah. And then, because he wouldn't take the bribe, the Tweed Ring tried to intimidate Harper's, the magazine. Because in addition to having the magazine, Harper's Publishing was the largest textbook publisher in New York. They made all the textbooks, most of the textbooks for the New York schools. Yeah, and and Harper's was dependent on the money from the textbooks to keep the magazine going, for example. And so Tweed tried to get the New York Board of Education to throw out all the textbooks and not buy any more Harper's textbooks. And this would bankrupt Harper's. But Harper's stood by Nast. And to thank Harper's, Nast created this cartoon. Yeah. And this is Tweed and his henchmen in the classroom trying to get the books from the kids, and Tweed looks sort of pathetic trying to get a textbook from a little kid, and one of his buddies is trying to throw the books out he's throwing the books out the windows, and he said Swede. He would always call me Sweet instead of Tweed. He didn't want to get in trouble. Swede and Tweenie. Swede is an honest man. Tweenie is an angel. He's a friend of the poor. So here's Nast going straight after the Tweed regime. In the end, Nast and other muckrakers brought Tweed down in 1871. Tweed and his henchmen were charged with 220 counts of fraud and malpractice. But because they owned the justice system, they stacked the jury with pro-Tweed Democrats. The jury was undecided, and they took a second trial. He was convicted to a year, and he did some time. Yeah, I don't know exactly how much time he did in jail. And then there was a civil suit filed against him, so not to put him in jail, but to take his money. He fled to Spain. And then the cartoon, there was a cartoon that was published in the Spanish newspaper, a Nast cartoon. And the Spanish police found him. They extradited him. And Tweed died in jail in 1878. This is the cartoon that the Spanish found and said that there was a reward, and the Spanish authorities were hoping that if they could get Tweed back to the U.S., they would get a reward. They didn't, but they extradited him to America, and he He died in jail where he belonged. To remember this, funnily enough, this is the cover of some sheet music that was written. Would you rather be a Tammany tiger or a teddy bear? This was a hit song in 1908. It's cute, right? Teddy Roosevelt, the teddy bear. We'll talk about this when we get to the age of reform. Okay. That's everything I want to teach you about this, but I do want to give you a postscript because I find it fascinating. I read this book by Terry Galway called Machine Made Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. It came out a few years back. And one thing I learned about Nast, who I thought was like this hero, in all of my lectures, I like glorified Nast. Like he risked his life and his family's life to expose this corruption. But then I learned that Nast, who was German born, he hated Catholics, not unlike Bismarck and the entire Prussian machine. He hated Catholics. And part of the reason that he was such a vehement and vociferous critic of the of the Tweed machine was because he hated Catholics and he hated the Irish so much. Now, he was sympathetic to Black and Chinese Americans, and I showed you a political cartoon he did where Lady Liberty is trying to protect a Chinese person from a mob. But he thought that the Catholics could never be American. They're always going to be loyal to the Pope, that the bishopry was corrupt. Yeah. And for this reason, Nast has been denied entrance into the New Jersey Hall of Fame because he was so openly anti-Catholic. Yeah. Not that anyone would really want to be in the New Jersey Hall of Fame. I mean, that's sort of like a dubious honor, but that's just my anti-New Jersey sentiment coming out there. I don't know. I suppose there are places in New Jersey that are beautiful. Western Jersey is beautiful. I drove through it. That's not the point. Okay. So Nast isn't just pure of heart. The reason Nast hated Tweed is because Tweed was pandering to the Catholics that Nast hated. This is called the American River Ganges. And these are the papists. You know, if you sort of see, these are like the papal crown. They're alligators that are going to eat American children. This was also in Harper's Weekly. So I want to be like, go Thomas Nast. You were able to defeat the corruption of the Tweed Ring. You risked life and limb to expose it. But it's hard to hang a photo of Thomas Nast on my mantle when he was drawing these images of, Catholics as alligators who are hell-bent on the blood of American children. Nasty, right? This is from 1871. Yeah. It's called the Priests and the Children. Yee. So, just to conclude, I want to talk a little bit about political machines. This is Boss Pendergast of Kansas City. He said, "The politician who steals is worse than the thief. He's a fool. With all the grand opportunities around for the man with political pull, there's no excuse for stealing a cent, right? You don't have to steal from the treasury. You could just pad contracts and engage in graft and kickbacks." George Washington Plunkett, the Tammany machine state senator, oops, typo. Politics is just a business like everything else. And the father, Richard J. Daley, not Richard M. of Chicago, said, "I don't worry if they're Democrats or Republicans. Just give them service and they'll become Democrats," which most Chicagoans did. Will Durant, my favorite political critic of the time, said, "A political machine is a united minority working against a divided majority." Sound familiar? JFK, namesake of our institution, "Mothers all want their sons to grow up to be president, but they don't want them to become politicians in the process." If you're to see the sausage being made, you might just become a vegetarian. From the Democratic president and from his Republican counterpart, in a way, Reagan said, "Politics is supposed to be the second oldest profession. I have come to realize that it bears a very close resemblance to the first." And if you don't know what that is alluding to, the oldest profession in the world, they say sometimes, is prostitution. And Mark Twain, the Will Durant of his day, the John Stewart of his day, said politicians are like diapers. They should both be changed frequently and for the same reason, because they are full of. Next slide. Um, in conclusion, I should probably just say something conclusive here, right? Look, immigration, industrialization, urbanization, and immigration fundamentally changed the landscape of American society. It's changed the American dream. It changed the role of women. It changed the class dynamics in American society. It changed everything. America was fundamentally different because of these, processes of industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. And you had all sorts of reactions to these, right? You have reformers and Americanization and the nativists and the APA, the gospelers, and they tried to make American cities more sustainable, more livable. And they succeeded in a great many ways. But where they failed, it took this process of immense graft and corruption and malfeasance to make American cities livable. And in many ways, political machines function paradoxically to make American cities much more livable. They provided jobs and opportunities and infrastructure and education. But in many ways, they made cities totally unlivable because of the crime and the corruption and the constant culture of fear that happens when you live in a mafia state. And it took the progressive movement in American history from 1900 to 1920 to try to bring together the best in politics and the best in non-governmental organizations to make America a more safe and just and verdant type of place. And so we'll get into the progressive era very soon in this class. I look forward to it. I hope you do too. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you found some joy in this. And if not, at least you found some profound interest. I'll see you soon. Bye.